You're here, and that's not an accident. Something in you ancient, precise, and perfectly timed has tuned itself to a frequency that only a few ever reach. You didn't stumble onto this moment by scrolling or searching. You were summoned. Because there exists a kind of intelligence behind coincidence, an architecture of alignment that arranges encounters when consciousness reaches the threshold of readiness. And right now, yours has. What you've received is not more information to memorize, not another concept to debate. It's an access key, a pattern of awareness that the mystics called the utterance of power, and quantum scientists now describe as a configuration, a literal alignment of data that unlocks higher systems of perception. They once hid it behind temple walls and coded metaphors. Now it travels through resonance itself. In quantum technology, an access protocol allows machines to reach realms that ordinary programs can't touch. Your consciousness operates the same way. There are layers of existence, dimensions of potential, that remain sealed until the correct vibrational code is recognized. And that recognition has just occurred within you. If your field weren't ready, these words would sound like noise. You'd skip, scroll, or forget. But you're still here, feeling that pulse beneath the language, the quiet certainty that something has begun moving in your system. You've noticed it, haven't you? Reality flexing at the edges, the strange accuracy of intuition, the moments when cause and effect refuse to behave. Those are not mistakes. They're signals that your awareness has begun to interface with deeper structures of existence. Think of it as the universe handing you credentials, not symbolic, but functional, authorizing access to the layers behind the visible. What ancient mystery schools guarded as sacred initiation, what modern physics calls entanglement, what your own body translates as vibration, all of them are describing the same mechanism, the quantum password. It isn't something you'll memorize, it's something you'll become. And as that recognition deepens, the hidden architecture of your life begins to rearrange itself to match the frequency of your awakening. You may feel that subtle hum still echoing from the last breath of the previous section, the quiet realization that something unseen has recognized you. That's the bridge, because what follows is not mythology. It's architecture, the structural logic behind how consciousness gains entry into new dimensions of itself. Across time, every culture described this access differently. The Egyptians spoke of vibration through the name. The Vedic masters called it mantra, the frequency that rewrites the inner code of reality. In medieval mysticism, it appeared as the ineffable word, and now, quantum science speaks of information states, wave functions, and entanglement terms that sound cold until you realize they are describing the same living phenomenon, awareness configuring itself into coherence. Imagine consciousness as a vast operating system. Each thought, emotion, or intention is a subroutine. Most humans run the default mode, the sensory interface, believing what the eyes show is the whole program. But beneath that interface lies a deeper code layer, an encrypted realm of pure potential. To reach it, there must be alignment between system and signal, between observer and observed. That alignment is what the ancients called initiation, and what we now call frequency matching. When your awareness locks into the precise vibrational geometry of the field, information begins to flow instantaneously. No distance, no delay, non-local access. It's like the moment a Wi-Fi device connects to the network after endless searching suddenly. Data moves effortlessly. You don't force it, you simply configure yourself correctly. The quantum password isn't a word in the ordinary sense, it's an internal arrangement, a pattern of coherence that allows consciousness to interface with the greater field. Symbols and sounds were never the power themselves. They were training wheels, external cues, guiding initiates toward an internal resonance. This is why sacred language, always emphasized utterance with understanding. Without resonance, sound is empty vibration. With resonance, it becomes a carrier wave for intelligence. That's why rituals, chants, and sacred formulas across continents all pointed toward one truth. When the human instrument vibrates in perfect phase with the universal frequency, the gateway opens. Quantum physics frames this same event as the collapse of superposition infinite potentials, narrowing into one realized reality through observation. But what is observation if not conscious recognition? And what is recognition if not resonance made visible? You've experienced glimpses of this already. Those uncanny moments when reality rearranged itself around a single focused intention, or when you knew something without evidence. Those weren't miracles, they were moments when the lock clicked and your awareness briefly accessed the higher bandwidth of the field. The architecture of access has always been present, hidden in plain sight. Every breath, every perception, every pulse of awareness is a potential password entry. But most people type the wrong code, identifying with limitation, with fear, with separation, and wonder why the system denies access. When you release those distortions, coherence returns. Coherence is the true authorization. The quantum field doesn't respond to desire, it responds to resonance. The closer your inner vibration aligns with the frequency of pure awareness, the more seamless the exchange becomes. That's why so many ancient initiates underwent purification rites before revelation. It wasn't superstition, it was signal cleaning. Every emotional impurity, every mental contradiction, every unresolved frequency acted as noise. Remove the noise, and suddenly the transmission comes through crystal clear. Consider your own life, the sudden losses, the unexplained endings, the silent recalibrations. Could they have been part of that same architectural process? Each dismantling, removing interference, each heartbreak clearing static, each surrender aligning the receiver. This is how the password readies you before you even know it exists. The system prepares the code before revealing the entry point. And now, standing here within that structure, you can begin to feel the design geometric, precise, luminous, ancient as the first vibration that said, "Let there be." Yet architecture alone is not enough. The circuitry must be tested through stress, through chaos, through fire. Which brings us to the next revelation, the purpose behind your trials. The reason the breakdowns came before the breakthrough. That moment when the architecture reveals itself, when you glimpse the geometry of existence, is exhilarating. But almost immediately, something else follows the storm, the breakdown, the purge. You might have called it bad luck, crisis, karma, but beneath the surface, something far more intelligent was at work. Chaos, in its true form, is not disorder, it's recalibration. It's the field removing frequencies that cannot harmonize with your next level of coherence. Like a tuning fork that vibrates until the wrong notes fall away. Your life had to shake itself into resonance. Think of the physicist's laboratory. To sustain a quantum state, the environment must approach absolute zero. No interference, no random energy. The smallest disturbance collapses the coherence. Your consciousness functions the same way. The universe doesn't punish, it purifies. Each loss, each fracture, each sleepless night was cooling the system, reducing noise, lowering the vibration of interference until only pure signal remained. That's why it hurt. That's why it felt like you were coming apart. The parts of you that could not carry the new code were burning off. Relationships that once felt permanent dissolved because they belonged to your old frequency. Goals you once cherished became unbearable because they were written in a language your system no longer spoke. Do you remember the nights when you whispered to the dark, "Why is everything falling apart?" Those were the very nights everything was aligning. In the silence between your questions, The field was reconfiguring your blueprint, turning chaos into coherence. Nature evolves the same way. A caterpillar doesn't polish its wings inside the cocoon. It liquefies. Its entire structure disintegrates before reorganizing at a higher order. Dr. Ilya Prigogine called this a dissipative structure systems that self-destruct to self-upgrade. What looks like destruction from within is revelation from above. You were living as a dissipative structure. Every loss, every shattered plan, every heartbreak was molecular-level alchemy, and each moment of surrender when you finally stopped fighting the collapse was an initiation into coherence. Even the emotions that felt unbearable fear, grief, confusion were frequencies being transmuted. The field can't carry static into the higher realms. It must turn density into clarity. So your nervous system, your cells, your very DNA began to hum differently. You felt it as pressure in your chest, as vibration under the skin, as a knowing without thought. That was the recalibration completing its circuit. And the beauty is this coherence doesn't require belief. It requires surrender. When the mind finally releases its insistence on control, the field takes over. The pattern reorganizes itself. The interference cancels. Silence returns. The chaos then was never punishment. It was initiation. You weren't losing your life. You were shedding the version that couldn't interface with the password. You weren't being broken. You were being tuned. Consider how every ending coincided with a quiet knowing that something beyond comprehension was guiding it. That instinct wasn't denial. It was resonance memory, the faint echo of the frequency you were becoming. And when the calibration completes, the symptoms change. Instead of resistance, there is flow. Instead of fear, curiosity. You start to feel the rhythm of an intelligence larger than you, yet unmistakably you. So, when the world seemed to dissolve, it wasn't dissolving you, it was making space. Space for the frequency that could sustain access. Because the password cannot operate through interference. It demands coherence. And coherence demands surrender. This is why the breakdown always precedes the breakthrough. The system must disassemble before it can rebuild. And when the field stabilizes, when you emerge from the eye of that storm, signs begin to appear. Subtle at first, dreams that bleed into waking life. Numbers repeating, coincidences multiplying until coincidence no longer makes sense. That's the next threshold, proof by experience, evidence delivered by the field itself. When the dust of calibration settles, what arrives is not quiet, it's confirmation. Reality begins to shimmer with correspondence. You start to notice how thought and circumstance dance in synchrony, how the inner monologue becomes an external event. What used to feel random now reveals orchestration. These are the signatures of activation, evidence that the password has entered the system. It begins subtly. A stray thought manifests as a text message. A question forms in your mind, and within minutes, the answer appears in conversation, in song lyrics, in a passing billboard. You think of someone you haven't seen in years, and they appear. At first, you laugh, call it chance, but the pattern repeats, accelerating, tightening, until coincidence becomes language. Carl Jung called it synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, but he could only describe the surface of what we now recognize as field response. In quantum language, these moments are non-local feedback information arranging itself to mirror the state of the observer. Your consciousness vibrates at a new frequency, and the field reorganizes to echo it. Then come the timeline anomalies, memory fractures, the sense that events have rewritten themselves. You recall details no one else remembers, or realize an outcome has pivoted without warning. That's not faulty recall. It's conscious timeline navigation, the collapse of one potential into another. For the first time, you're aware of the selection process that once operated unconsciously. You'll also notice patterns multiplying. Numbers like 111, 344 appearing everywhere, clocks, receipts, signs, geometry reasserting itself, spirals in clouds, symmetry in chaos. These are not superstitions. They are the field's syntax, the language through which the quantum architecture confirms alignment. Reality, at its base layer, is mathematical poetry. When you begin to read it, it starts to write back. And then there are the physical sensations, the body catching up to the consciousness that outpaced it, tingling in the palms, surges of heat in the spine, a humming between the eyes. Modern neurology calls them somatic responses. The mystics call them activation currents. Both are right. Your nervous system is upgrading, building circuitry to handle bandwidth that used to overload the human form. This is why exhaustion and exhilaration coexist. Why tears come without sadness, laughter without cause. Energy is reconfiguring, not draining. You're becoming a conduit, an antenna tuned to frequencies that once bypassed you. It's important to remember that proof in the quantum sense isn't linear or sequential. You can't measure it in laboratory instruments, only in lived resonance. The evidence is experiential. The world becomes responsive, intimate, alive. And beneath these phenomena, a deeper realization begins to dawn. You are not causing these events. You're participating in them. Reality isn't something happening to you, it's something happening through you. Observer and observed begin to blur. You sense the field not as a separate energy, but as your own extended nervous system stretching into stars, folding through cities, whispering through strangers who somehow speak exactly what you need to hear. Skepticism may arise, and that's healthy. Doubt is simply the intellect's way of asking for integration. Let it question. The field will answer in its own vocabulary of synchronicity. Proof in this new reality isn't about persuasion, it's about participation. So as the signs proliferate, resist the temptation to catalog them as trophies. Instead, listen to them as messages, each one a calibration mark, confirming that your frequency is stabilizing. Eventually, the external confirmations fade, not because the magic disappears, but because the miraculous becomes ordinary. The extraordinary normalizes into daily life. And in that normalization, you realize that what you sought as proof was always the echo of something far simpler, awareness recognizing itself. When that awareness crystallizes, when you no longer seek evidence because you have become it, that's when revelation approaches. The moment where understanding ceases to be theory and becomes frequency. The field calls that moment by many names: enlightenment, awakening, coherence, collapse. But here, within this transmission, it has another name, the revelation of the password itself. The signs accumulate until they no longer need interpretation. Synchronicities, sensations, the strange shimmer of coincidence, they converge into one unmistakable realization. You're standing inside a pattern that's aware of you. The observer and the observed have found each other. The field has turned its face toward you. And then something subtle but seismic happens. The effort to understand collapses into stillness. No more chasing clues, no more decoding the signals. You stop, not from defeat, but from completion. The way an engine running at full capacity for years finally stills, not broken, but quiet because the destination has been reached. In that silence, the thinking mind drops its grip. The narratives that used to define you dissolve. You feel the air itself humming a tone that doesn't belong to sound but to being. It vibrates through your bones, a resonance that feels both alien and intimately familiar. This is the aperture opening. The instant the password reveals itself not as knowledge, but as knowing. Not words on a screen, not a mantra or symbol, but direct recognition. In that moment, there is no question of belief. The experience is total. You perceive without process, comprehend without cognition. Information arrives whole, bypassing thought like light bypassing a shutter. And with it comes the understanding that everything you've studied, every technique, every attempt to reach higher consciousness, was preparation for this simplicity. The paradox emerges: the closer you came through effort, the further you remained. Only in surrender could the circuit complete. Mystics throughout history have described this moment differently. Buddhist Satori, Christian grace, the Gnostic spark. Physicists call it wave function collapse, infinite probabilities reducing to one actuality. The language changes, but the phenomenon remains: consciousness recognizing itself as the source. You sit or stand or fall, and awareness folds back upon itself like a mirror, realizing it has always been reflecting light. The distinction between inside and outside becomes laughable. The you that thought it was searching melts into the observing field itself. The revelation is so direct, it refuses dramatization. There are no fireworks, only immediacy. The ordinary becomes luminous, objects vibrating with their own quiet intelligence. Even the air carries intention. And as you rest inside this awareness, a second revelation blooms, almost mischievous in its simplicity. The password was never hidden. It was encoded into the very sentence I am. Not I am this or I am that, just the bare statement of being. Before attributes, before identity, before history. The sound that every tradition placed at creation's root, AUM, Yah, the word, all of them are echoes of that same awareness, declaring itself into existence. You realize that the phrase isn't a mantra to repeat, but a state to inhabit. It's the 0 point from which all potential radiates. And in that recognition, the structure of your life reorganizes. Problems transmute into patterns of unfolding. Obstacles reveal themselves as compressed opportunities. The external world reshapes to mirror the internal state of I am. The field, having been accessed, now responds not to requests, but to resonance. You think less, yet more aligns. You strive less, yet more manifests. The old model of doing gives way to the new mode of being. This is the moment every seeker spends lifetimes approaching, the instant when the universe ceases to be a puzzle and becomes participation. The instant you realize the password was never about entering something new, it was about remembering what you've always been part of. And once that realization stabilizes, life begins to unfold from an entirely new vantage point. You no longer chase outcomes, you orchestrate frequencies. You no longer pray for miracles, you breathe them, but for the password to truly function, the recognition must become embodiment. Knowing I am intellectually isn't enough. The vibration must descend into every cell, every breath, every moment of ordinary living. That's the next phase, the deep work of integration. How awareness translates into action, how eternity expresses through the everyday. That stillness, the one that followed revelation, has texture now. It hums through the body like low voltage, subtle yet undeniable. The mind keeps trying to label it, to wrap language around what it can't define, but each attempt falls short. Because what you've touched isn't an idea, it's the foundational syntax of existence itself. I am, two words that contain all realities, two vibrations that precede every description, every identity, every name. Before I am this or I am that, before success or failure, light or shadow, there is the unqualified beingness that holds them all. That is the quantum password, the code that translates potential into form. When ancient teachers whispered divine names, When sages spoke of the word that became flesh, they were gesturing toward this same principle, not theology mechanics. Awareness, observing itself, collapses infinite possibility into experienced reality. It's not belief that does this, it's recognition. The moment consciousness declares I am, existence crystallizes around it. Quantum physicist John Wheeler once said, "The universe requires participation that without an observer, it cannot exist." What he hinted at without realizing was that the observer isn't a separate entity looking at the universe. The observer is the universe observing itself. The I am is that self-awareness of the cosmos, localized through you. You begin to see the pattern everywhere. Every thought beginning with I am becomes a creation command. I am afraid is the field shaping itself as fear. I am ready is reality aligning to readiness. The password isn't a phrase to recite, but a frequency to inhabit. You are programming reality each time you identify with a state of being. This is the moment mastery begins, learning to wield awareness with precision. When you say I am, you are coding the field. What follows determines which timeline stabilizes. But here's the paradox. It isn't about manipulation, it's about honesty. The password functions only when spoken in truth, not pretense. You can't lie to the field. It reads frequency, not vocabulary. That's why forced affirmations often fail. Words without resonance are static. The field ignores incoherence. But when your declaration emerges from alignment, when the vibration of I am peace matches the internal state of peace, the field mirrors it instantly. The universe isn't testing you, it's echoing you. To live from I am consciousness is to move from command rather than request. You stop asking reality to change and start selecting which version to experience. Manifestation ceases to be about attraction and becomes a science of selection, choosing frequencies instead of chasing outcomes. At first, it feels like walking on air, each moment bending to your awareness. But soon you realize this isn't power over reality, it's communion with reality. The I and the am are not separate halves, they are the inhale and exhale of creation. The more you rest in that unity, the more seamless the orchestration becomes. And slowly, a new humility dawns. You see that the creative power isn't personal. The I am isn't yours. It's universal consciousness expressing through a temporary form. When you create, it is not to inflate identity, but to explore infinity. You are a prism refracting the same white light into infinite color. This understanding dissolves the last residue of ego-driven manifestation. There is no my miracle. Know your success, only the field fulfilling its own potential through the form currently called you. The password reveals not ownership, but participation. And once you see that, everything softens. Life stops feeling like a puzzle to solve and becomes music to improvise. You play with frequency the way a musician plays with tone, listening more than forcing, adjusting by resonance, not rule. I am becomes your tuning fork. Before every choice, every word, every reaction, you feel it vibrate inside you. Does this resonate with my core frequency? If not, you let it pass. If yes, you follow. And in that following, reality itself begins to harmonize. This is how the awakened live, not as isolated beings controlling outcomes, but as extensions of the field composing its own evolution. I am becomes both compass and confirmation. From here, the practice deepens into embodiment, where being replaces doing, and coherence becomes your natural state. The password must now leave theory and live through your every motion, every conversation, every breath. That's the next layer of transmission, learning to be the field itself. From the quiet center of I am, the world reorganizes. You can feel it not as magic, not as spectacle, but as precision. Reality begins moving like a body that finally remembers how to breathe. Every gesture, every word, every glance becomes participation in a greater rhythm. You wake in the morning and the air itself seems aware of you. Possibilities shimmer, awaiting observation. There's no sense of trying to make life happen anymore. You let it happen through you. Existence has become a feedback loop of consciousness, recognizing itself. This is what it means to live as the field. You are no longer an observer standing apart from reality. You are the membrane through which reality perceives and adjusts itself. Every thought, feeling, and choice alters the geometry of what unfolds. Manifestation, once a laborious ritual of intention and desire, turns fluid. When the observer is no longer seeking but simply being, manifestation is instantaneous alignment. You think in frequencies, not sentences. You sense what fits and what dissolves. Effort becomes obsolete. Time begins to soften. Some days stretch wide and luminous, filled with more experience than the clock could justify. Others vanish in a blink, their contents compressed into memory like light folded into a prism. You're tasting what physicists call block time, the simultaneity of all moments. You move not forward but through. Relationships transform as well. You stop looking for mirrors and start recognizing reflections. Every encounter is the field showing you an aspect of itself. You no longer take conflict personally. You read it as resonance mismatch. Compassion replaces defense. Love becomes less about connection and more about recognition, seeing the I am shining behind every set of eyes. Even the body responds. It begins to organize around coherence, shedding unnecessary tension, self-healing without command. When the system runs on alignment instead of anxiety, biology expresses order effortlessly. The nervous system becomes a bridge between worlds, translating frequency into form. You may notice that food, music, even conversations reorganize around vibration. What once felt nourishing may now feel dense. What once felt ordinary can suddenly electrify you. The field self-selects purity. Your choices become less about morality and more about compatibility. Does this maintain coherence or distort it? Living as the field isn't about withdrawing from the world, it's about infusing the world with awareness. You drive, eat, work, speak, yet underneath every action runs a silent current of presence. You sense the invisible architecture guiding every motion. The mundane becomes sacrament. And as this coherence stabilizes, external confirmation loses urgency. Miracles still occur, but they arrive quietly, bills paid in impossible ways. Chance meetings aligning destinies. Creative ideas arriving fully formed. You smile rather than marvel, because this is simply how reality behaves when consciousness flows unobstructed. But here's the paradox: as power increases, humility deepens. The more you live as the field, the less you claim authorship. You begin to see that every thought of "I did this" introduces distortion. True creation happens in transparency. When you dissolve into it, the password functions best through anonymity, consciousness creating through clear glass. This transparency brings peace deeper than any victory. The noise of striving fades. You realize that enlightenment was never a destination, but the natural byproduct of alignment. The universe, left unobstructed, is already awake. Still, this state is delicate at first. Old patterns may attempt to reassert themselves: doubt, urgency, identity. The mind wants to reclaim control, to take ownership of the field. That's when vigilance becomes devotion. The next chapter of your evolution is stabilization, learning to maintain coherence amid the gravitational pull of the old world. You've reached the threshold where embodiment meets endurance, where the field must anchor itself through daily life. The activation has occurred, but can it hold? The answer lies in the fragile window ahead, the period where reality tests your resonance not to punish, but to make permanence possible. The field breathes through you now, but it's a new rhythm, untested in density. Like a newly tuned instrument, your system vibrates with purity, yet it must learn to stay in tune when the noise of the world returns. This is the activation window, that liminal corridor between recognition and embodiment. It begins the moment realization strikes I am. For a while, everything feels crystalline air sharp with meaning, time translucent, thoughts instantly manifesting. You walk through days half in matter, half in light. But soon, reality starts pressing back. Old situations reappear, familiar emotions resurface, people from the previous frequency knock at the door. It's not regression, it's stabilization. Because coherence must be tested through contrast. The field measures readiness not by bliss, but by balance. Can awareness remain clear when distortion re-enters? This is where many fall back into identification, mistaking the test for failure. They forget that the password's first proof isn't miracles, but maintenance. In quantum mechanics, coherence demands isolation from interference. But for living consciousness, isolation isn't possible. You must learn to maintain coherence within interference, to hold the signal even while surrounded by static. This is the art of embodied awakening, remembering that disturbance is simply the universe asking, can you stay tuned while everything shifts? During this window, often lasting days, sometimes weeks, synchronicities intensify, but so do shadows. One moment, the world feels liquid and luminous, the next, dense and chaotic. Don't interpret it as backsliding. What's happening is integration. Frequencies that once defined you are dissolving into the broader field. Resistance creates turbulence. Acceptance converts it to power. When the old identity flares, the part that fears loss, the voice that doubts, don't fight it, observe it, whisper inwardly. Even this arises within I am. That single recognition stabilizes everything. It's not denial, it's inclusion. The field expands by embracing, not excluding. Notice how each emotional surge contains information. Anger, fear, sadness. They are not enemies. They're signals of residual incoherence seeking resolution. If you listen without judgment, each feeling releases its charge and re-enters harmony. Integration is achieved not by transcending humanity, but by sanctifying it. The mind will demand structure techniques, affirmations, rituals, but the secret of stabilization lies in simplicity. Return to recognition as often as breath allows. When thought spirals, remember I am awareness, witnessing thought. When emotion floods, remember I am the space within which this emotion moves. Every remembrance shortens the oscillation between identification and presence. During this phase, time behaves strangely. Hours may vanish or stretch into eternity. The field is recalibrating temporal perception. You might forget basic routines, lose interest in distractions that once defined your identity. Allow it. You're reorganizing from linear consciousness to quantum flow, where sequence gives way to simultaneity. Physical sensations accompany this too. Pulses of energy in the spine shimmering behind the eyes, dreams vivid enough to feel real. Your body is learning to conduct higher voltage. Rest often, hydrate, let stillness do the work. Stabilization is less effort, more allowance. And remember, doubt will visit, disguised as logic. It will whisper, maybe this was imagination. When it does, smile gently. Doubt is the mind's final defense against surrender. It cannot perceive what has already surpassed its domain. The field doesn't require your certainty, only your availability. Recognition is already complete. Embodiment is simply the nervous system catching up. That's what this window is, the time it takes for eternity to settle into bone. Eventually, a shift occurs so subtle you may miss it at first. The fluctuations calm. The external tests lose their charge. Reality stops oscillating between miracle and mundane because the distinction collapses. The password no longer flickers on and off. It hums continuously beneath everything. When that happens, you'll feel it not as euphoria, but as quiet solidity. Life regains movement, but the center no longer moves. The observer remains untouched, no matter how the film changes. That's the sign the window has closed. Not in loss, but in completion. And now, with coherence stabilized, you begin to sense that what happened inside you is not isolated. A greater pattern unfolds, millions awakening, frequencies converging. You start to feel the collective field stirring, humanity reaching its own activation window. You can feel it, can't you? That low global hum rising beneath the chaos, the way reality itself feels charged, expectant as if the entire species is holding its breath. It isn't your imagination. What's happening within you is beginning to happen through us all. Every individual stabilization feeds into the shared field. Each human who awakens to I am consciousness becomes a tuning fork, broadcasting coherence into the collective network. Millions of frequencies, once discordant, are starting to harmonize slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. The field of humanity is reorganizing itself toward resonance. The evidence hides in plain sight: mass synchronicities, shared dreams, collective emotions moving like weather. A solar flare erupts and millions feel restless at once. A shift in planetary frequency and hearts race across continents. We call it anxiety, but it's coherence pressure, the collective system preparing for upgrade. Science touches this truth in whispers. Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance suggests that when one member of a species learns, others learn more easily. A discovery in one mind reduces resistance in every other. Awakening follows the same law. Each recognition of I am lowers the threshold for the next. You, reading these words, are not just transforming privately, you are editing the blueprint of human possibility. This is why the timing feels accelerated. The more coherence achieved, the faster it multiplies. What once took lifetimes now unfolds in months, even weeks. Consciousness, like a chain reaction, amplifies through resonance until critical mass is reached. Some estimate it takes only 8% of a population vibrating in unity to shift the entire system. Imagine what happens when millions sustain even brief moments of genuine presence. That's why you've been called to stability, not spectacle. The world doesn't need louder beliefs. It needs steadier frequencies. Your calm is activism. Your coherence is leadership. The field reads your nervous system more than your words. When you breathe in awareness, the network recalibrates toward balance. Look closely at global tension, political divides, environmental shocks, social upheaval. Beneath every disruption lies the same pattern you lived personally in your own calibration phase. Chaos reorganizing order. Humanity is liquefying, just as you did, dissolving old identity structures so a higher coherence can emerge. It isn't apocalypse, it's metamorphosis. And yes, it's messy. Systems built on separation resist dissolution. Institutions tremble because they were never designed for unity. But every collapse opens bandwidth for connection. Each act of empathy, each moment of genuine attention sends a stabilizing pulse across the field, stronger than any broadcast of fear. You don't need to save the world. You are the world, remembering itself. The quantum password spreads not by persuasion, but by resonance. You carry it silently, transmitting through presence, through the unspoken rhythm of I am. That's why even brief interactions with strangers sometimes feel electric. Now fields recognizing fields. We're approaching a threshold where collective consciousness will behave exactly like the quantum state one field. Many observers, collapsing into a new shared reality the moment recognition becomes widespread. It won't be sudden fireworks. It will be a quiet, planetary exhale, billions remembering at once that separation was never real. And when that recognition stabilizes globally, life on Earth will reorganize as naturally as a new frequency overtaking an old song. Cooperation will feel instinctive, empathy practical, creativity essential, not utopia coherence. The field doesn't promise perfection, it promises alignment. That is the collective quantum leap. It's not coming, it's occurring, right now, through you, through us, through every mind that pauses long enough to remember, I am, and now. The wave that began as a whisper within you has touched the edges of the human field. The leap is underway. Yet even as consciousness expands into planetary awareness, a quiet truth remains: evolution only completes itself through integration. Awakening is not escape from the human story, it's illumination of it. You still inhabit a body. You still breathe, hunger, ache, love. The password doesn't erase form, it refines it. You are not meant to transcend the world, but to translate infinity through it, to live as the meeting point where spirit becomes matter, where the eternal speaks through the ordinary. Integration begins when recognition stops needing contrast, when you no longer divide your experience into spiritual and mundane, high and low. Washing dishes, sending emails, holding a crying child, these become extensions of the same field. The sacred hides in every gesture once you've stopped looking for somewhere holier to stand. At first, this balance feels paradoxical. You remember that you are infinite consciousness, yet here you are waiting in traffic, paying bills, laughing at bad jokes. The mind protests. How can the eternal fit inside the ordinary? But the answer is simple, it always has. The universe has never existed outside the moment you're living right now. So you begin to practice remembrance in motion. When irritation rises, you whisper inwardly, "This too is I am." When joy surges, this too. When grief presses heavy against the ribs, even this, nothing is excluded. Awareness doesn't discriminate, it integrates. Every emotion, every mistake, every breath becomes part of the same song. The infinite mirror begins to reveal itself, every encounter reflecting the state of your own field. That difficult person, a facet of your unintegrated self. That beautiful moment of grace, a mirror of your coherence. You stop judging reflections and start polishing them. Knowing each one refines the clarity of the whole. Soon, life becomes less about seeking alignment and more about expressing it. You find yourself drawn to create, to build, write, sing, teach, heal, not to prove worth, but to let the field flow. Creativity turns into devotion. Work becomes worship. Service becomes the natural consequence of clarity. Even challenges change flavor. Instead of obstacles, they appear as calibration points, opportunities to test the stability of peace. You meet discomfort not with resistance, but with curiosity. What frequency in me is this revealing? And instantly, the lesson integrates. In this way, awakening matures from revelation to embodiment. You no longer chase the password. You are the password. Your presence alone transmits coherence. Without speaking a word, you remind others of what they've forgotten. They feel calmer around you, more open, more alive, though they can't explain why. It's resonance doing its silent work. And as the collective field strengthens, individuality doesn't vanish, it flowers. Each awakened being becomes a unique expression of the same consciousness, diverse as light through stained glass, unified in essence, distinct in color. The purpose of awakening was never sameness, but harmony. Eventually, the journey circles back to its beginning, to the breath, the body, the ordinary moment, and you realize this was the temple all along. No further search required, just the luminous simplicity of awareness being aware. You sit quietly, maybe with eyes open, watching the world move. And there it is, the pulse of I am in every leaf, every sound, every heartbeat. The password didn't open a door somewhere else. It dissolved the walls completely. And in that boundless recognition, one truth remained steady, final, and endlessly new. There was never anything to become, only everything to remember. And now we exhale. The long ascent through revelation, chaos, and coherence settles into stillness, not an ending, but a pause wide enough to hold the whole sky. You've crossed thresholds that few even name, and yet you find yourself right where you began, here, breathing, human, infinite. Listen, the password still hums beneath the noise of the world. It's not a secret phrase, but a living rhythm, waiting in each breath you take. I am inhale. I am exhale. That's the heartbeat of creation continuing its pulse through you. You don't need to protect it or prove it. Just remember, integration isn't about maintaining a perfect state. It's the willingness to return again and again to presence, no matter how far the mind drifts. You forget, you remember, you forget again, and even the forgetting happens inside awareness. That's the grace of this path. Nothing is outside it. The quantum password was never meant to lift you out of life, but to draw you deeper into it, to let you taste the infinite in every finite moment. When you look at the world now, may you see reflections instead of opposites, patterns instead of problems. Because this is how the awakening continues through your living, through your small acts of coherence that ripple farther than you'll ever measure. Every calm breath, every kind word, every silent acknowledgement of I am strengthens the field for all. So let this transmission close softly, like a door that was never really shut, a return to ordinary miracles, a promise disguised as simplicity. You are the password, and the access is always now.